Good evening. I'm Lucinda Andriani. I serve as the Flood Control District Administrator, and I recognize many of you. Several were here during, I think, the Copeland presentation, so welcome back. This is for the Peaceful Way corridor, which is basically the Kevin's Way up through to Thames and that area. So we'll be focused on that piece tonight. If you're in another area, we won't, more than just broadly, we'll talk about the entire area so you have the understanding of the big picture in terms of across the 9 watersheds and what's facing us. But we'll largely be focused on Peaceful Way this evening. So first, thank you for being here. And I think, how many people were here during Schultz? I know quite a few of you were, right? And went through that effort, and I think, I was here through that as well, and as was really all of our team that we've assembled again to take on this challenge. And I think tonight you'll see why are we having such a challenge, and just the magnitude of the volume of water now is a lot greater, and you'll see that. So tonight we're going to walk through a little bit of history for those that weren't here during Schultz, and then I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about the big picture plan, and then we'll dive in, Mike Carrolley with Natural Channel Design. Natural channel design for this corridor is both doing the engineering for the on-forest measures that are being proposed, as well as the measures, the in-neighborhood flood mitigation measures. So Mike's going to cover both of those elements, and we'll take a few questions at the end. But back behind this little divider here, we have some tables set up, and the plans are over there. And I really strongly encourage you to go over and look at the plans, determine where your property is in relationship to the proposed channel. Mike will give you the details on the channel, but go over and look at where it is, and so you have an understanding about, is your property going to be impacted by that channel or not. And one of the things that we had as you came in, and surely we'll make them available as well, is if your property is proposed for the channel, the mitigation, that we need to secure from you a right of entry, and I'll talk about this more later, to be able to perform some of the pre-engineering work, do some of the survey work and so forth. So, and that's kind of the first step in this process, and I'll talk about then the next step is securing a drainage easement and mortgage release. So we'll talk again more about that. So. But first I want to say, this has been a horrific summer. And I know all of you are really, have gone through a lot of suffering and a lot of impact. And, we're trying to do the best we can. And it's been a tough go for everybody. We've had over 45 flood events. And even with Schultz, those of you that were here, it took about 2 years to get to that number of flood events. So you'll see some of the data about why that's the case. And we'll move through that. But before I get into more of the details, I'm going to introduce Vice Chair of both our Flood Control District and Board of Supervisors, Geronimo Vasquez. And he's going to do a little intro, and then we'll get into the presentation. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Geronimo Vasquez. I'm supervisor for District 2 and current vice chair. I feel frustrated that I keep having to come to have these conversations with this community, because I really feel for all of you how much we've gone through since April, because this has just been an extension since tunnel fire into pipeline fire, and then slammed into all these floods. And so I really empathize with you. The first time that I was ever out here when there was a rain event was when we presented to the deputy chief of the Forest Service, and we gave him a tour, and while we're out here, we almost got blocked off on Campbell. We had to go around, and right as we pulled out, water hit through government tank, and they Johnson Acres? Yeah. And they closed the highway behind us. And then we went over to Pioneer Valley to see potential damage there. We drove through, and as we pulled out, water hit that community as well. And so, that was when I learned the fear that all of you have to endure every time it rains. Hearing those rocks coming down that channel on Campbell was scary, and it was definitely an exclamation point. We had just finished presenting to the Forest Service about our ask of what we need to do, which we'll talk about tonight. And it was pushing $140, $150 million. And, when they finished that tour, their answer was, we believe you, it's a problem. They understood it, they felt it, because they felt that fear of hearing the water come down and seeing the effects. And so, I really empathize for all you, and I want to thank you all for your patience with us. I know it hasn't been easy. I know there have been times where we haven't been able to address your issues as fast as we would like to or you would like to. We're doing the best we can. As you'll see tonight, and you get the full picture of what we're dealing with, it's just overwhelming. I'll put it in perspective. Last year with Museum Flood, we dealt with 7 floods. Okay, that was one watershed. All the damage that we heard, that the Grandview corridor and Sunnyside or whatnot, that was one watershed. We have 9 watersheds damaged, and 8 of them are coming in this direction. And so that's very complicated. And we have some that were not damaged before that are now severely damaged, that had damage high up on slopes. And so fans that used to protect certain areas, like above Copeland, have now blown out. And so now all that sediment is coming down. And this is an issue that is going to take years to fix completely. Not even fix completely, because we'll never really be able to take away the full danger or risk. But the mitigation that we're proposing to do, it's going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight. We're already ahead of the game in comparison to Schultz, in terms of already going through those processes, lobbying with folks at the federal level and the state level. I spent the morning today with our emergency manager, Wes Dyson, and the DMFF and DEMA coordinator, and we gave her a tour to kind of get the state to see the damage and the need that we have. Next week, I'll be going to Washington, D.C., and I'll be lobbying on transportation, because we're so far, like last year, we had success with the Forest Service for on-forest restoration and the channels. The new thing that we didn't have to deal with last year were the highways. Now we need highway improvement, drainage improvements. And the reason is because if we're able to get the funding for on-forest measures and the channels, but we don't upgrade the highways, they're going to continue to close. And that's an economic driver, not to mention your all's way to get home that we can't keep having shut down. And so we need to make those improvements. And so last week I was in Maricopa at a meeting, talking to ADOT at a conference, trying to really push, we need these upgrades, we need this help. And each part, the on-forest measures, the channels, and the highway improvements, it's gonna take between $40 and $50 million for each of those sections. And the one that's the most complex is the government tank corridor. And that corridor is going to require almost 20 to 25% of the whole ask just to deal with that corridor. And the corridors that don't have mitigation will have additional work to do. So the ones that have already had mitigation from Schultz, we gotta improve those, bring them up, improve their volume of water that they can receive. There are areas that weren't mitigated last time, but we have shovel-ready projects. We need to find funding and get those projects into place. And then we have government tank that has no engineering, and we're starting from ground zero, which means it's going to take some time, and it's going to be very complex, and it leads into Doney Park and some density down there. So this is really a complex issue. And again, I thank you for your patience, because I know that this is something that we want resolved quickly. It's not fun going through this. Every time I hear the weather alerts, because I'm patched in, so every time you get it, I get it. I start getting a little fidgety and scared, almost like, oh no, here we go again, But the thing I'll say is that if we can get these on-forest measures done, one thing we learned from Museum Flood last year was that if we can get these alluvial fans done on the forest, it can have a huge impact. Between last summer and this summer, we were able to get 3 of the 4 alluvial fans that we were looking to put on forest. Since that time, this year to date, we have not had a major flood event come through the Museum Flood Scar area. Now, granted, we haven't had the same levels of rain as last year, but that gives us hope that if we can get on force, we can get some of these mitigation efforts done up there. It can reduce the sediment and the water flow into the communities, into their water flow. And so that's the hope, is that this plan that we present tonight is that dream, that vision. If we could get it the way we want, this is the best we could do with what we think we can get done. So thank you for your patience. Please stay after, ask your questions, talk to someone. Don't leave without talking to someone. Please, if you have any lingering questions or doubts, please voice them tonight. I'm going to be staying after. You can email my office. That's the best way that I can help support you. And we'll get through this together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I also want to note that this evening we have Louise Porter here with us this evening. She's with the Small Business Administration, and they just launched locally their disaster response program. They have a low-interest loan program that is now we've qualified for, and those of you that have had impacts both to property and to your homes could be eligible for these loans. And she's going to get up and answer some basic, provide some basic information. And they've set up a local location here at the county's Health and Human Services Department on King Street. And so would really encourage people, and she'll talk more about it, but really encourage you to consider applying for it. The interest rates are very favorable, and which she'll share. I don't know, Shirley, did we end up bringing the fact sheet? Their fact sheets are here. Okay, great. There should be fact sheets then at your seat there. And you'll see that the interest rates are very favorable. And they're set now for this disaster. So even though I think the feds raised the rates today, it won't affect this from what I understand. So anyway, she'll have more information about that, but really encourage you to consider that. There is opportunity. I know two kind of areas that you're particularly interested in is your private roads and how you're dealing with the damage to your private roads. And then two is the impacts to your property, not just your home, but your property. So we really appreciate her being here this evening. She's been working with us on a communication plan and meeting with media since the minute she arrived. And she's been really helping us get the word out. And a lot of information, all the information now that she's provided, as well as the links, is also on the Schultz Pipeline flood area website that the county district with the flood control district has. So you can also go there and get more information too. So, all right, with that, we're going to leap in here, talk a little bit about the history. I don't need this. I have a mic. I always do this. I don't need to mic up both. There we go. So we'll jump into some history here. I think pretty much everyone is aware that, since 2010, the district and county and many of you have been dealing with post-wildfire flooding impacts. And this just kind of is the litany of what's been experienced and what's been expended. And we're now approaching $85 million that's been spent to date on those various mitigation efforts and response efforts. Part of that, to go back to, for those of you, again, that were not here, our original meeting with this corridor was on April 18th, 2012. Some of you may remember that. And I grabbed a couple slides from that presentation. And basically, at that time, much like right now, we're seeking funding through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That's through the U.S. Department of Agriculture for what's called EWP, Emergency Watershed Protection. And you probably remember had a lot of initials back then, a lot of initials now. And some of these slides just reiterate, what some of the considerations that we had then in terms of the mitigation, and these all continue to remain in terms of, we can't divert water. The channel has to really follow where the primary water flow is now and so forth. And again, Mike will talk more about that. And the need that no matter what mitigation we construct, we can't mitigate to every rainfall event. So, if we construct to a 25-year Schultz, it was all 5-year, post-wildfire 5-year. And what we're looking at now is in the range of closer to 25 years of what's being proposed. So events larger than that, will likely overflow whatever mitigation. So it's really important that you maintain your flood insurance. Next slide was also from that in terms of, working together. And as I mentioned back then as well, we needed to seek out the right of entry forms to be able to start that, initiate that process. And frankly, in this corridor, I don't think I think we did have one additional meeting, but as people are aware, there was a pretty strong contingent that it was opposed to the mitigation and did not want to move forward. And so it did not move forward, either in this corridor or in the Copeland corridor. So, but we're back today, and the goal now is to look forward. And I think we have put together a really great plan that can have a really big impact, really big positive impact in this corridor. And we're hopeful that people will get on board and we can move forward. Again, as it was then, this is about an integrated system, and we're gonna talk about this three-prong approach. The biggest game changer is what we do on forest. If we can reduce down, as the supervisor mentioned, if we can reduce down the level of sediment coming off the forest, that's the most critical piece. But also those measures on forest also typically have reduced the volume of water as well to some extent. It varies, depends on how saturated those broader fan areas become over time, but we've seen tremendous success, and you certainly all witnessed this because as we constructed in the other 5 watersheds, other than the Brandis 1,000-year flood event or rainfall event in 2018, we saw no flooding. In fact, we saw virtually no water leave the forest because of the on-forest measures after the Schultz construction that was done from 13 through 15. So, and similarly, as is mentioned, we've seen that with museum. But again, there can be events that exceed that, as we saw in Brandis. But the mitigation will still have a tremendous impact, just like it is now. It's still having a positive impact in most of those corridors. So a little bit there about that. Unfortunately now, largely because of the pipeline fire, tunnel had a little bit of impact, but not much. We are seeing anywhere from 7 to 22 times the flows in these corridors. So we're seeing a significant increase in the flows. And that's because a lot of the upper steep slopes either reburned or were partially burned during Schultz and now have burned very severely. And in some of the corridors, it's much, much worse than it was. You'll see as we go into this here, I'll show you a chart that shows that increase modeled, how we modeled to look at what was the increase in each of the flood corridors. And you'll see, as was mentioned, Government Tank, Upaki Trails have been the ones where it's increased the most, but every area, every watershed has been pretty severely impacted. So in terms of those impacts, I think you're all aware, as I mentioned, we've experienced 45 major flood events, issued, we work very closely with the Weather Service, and Wes and his team we have a flood director that's on 24 hours a day, that's monitoring the weather, monitoring the rain gauges, and they then make the determination, okay, do we need to issue an alert based on that rainfall data? And again, in communication with the Weather Service, and we've issued over at least 45 rave events, right, Wes? So a lot of activity. Last night, I think, I didn't count them specifically, but I know we had from gauge alerts alone, we got probably upwards of at least 15 gauge alerts last night throughout the area. So everybody was working through the night, monitoring all that. If you look at the area that's at risk for flooding, it's about 1,500 homes, and that includes a section of the city of Flagstaff as well. And the property valuation associated with that risk is about $1.3 billion, so a lot of value at risk. This is the chart that I've been referencing here. This shows the increase in the flows. The large red bars are what was modeled this year based upon the pipeline fire. We take the burn severity map that's produced by the Burned Area Emergency Response Team. It's a Forest Service team. We had a representative on that as well. And we take that and then we modeled a 2-inch storm in 45 minutes. That's been a storm that we have seen that's had pretty big impacts over the last 10 years, looking at the gauge data here in Schultz. And that's how we selected that storm to model. And you can see probably in this corridor, it's 5 to 7 times greater. The little orange bars are post-tunnel. And then the blue bars are that after we completed all the mitigation for Schultz in 2016, Jay Fuller came back and ran the model again with all the mitigation in place. And there was assumption made relative to the level of recovery on forest. And you can see just the magnitude of the increase since that time frame of what we're all dealing with today. Sure. We have not. In fact, the next chart will show you we have not. In fact, this next chart shows, this is a compilation. This isn't event by event, but a compilation of events. You can see at the far right-hand column what's the recurrence interval. And as I was speaking about earlier, like in Brandis in 18, we had a 1,000-year rainfall event. I mentioned for museum last year, I may or may not have mentioned last year, we had a 200 to 300-year event. We had a 200-year event. This year, we've had all very low intensity events, but we've had a lot of rainfall, and we'll show you that data as well. So we haven't, even though we've seen really dramatic flooding, we have not had intense rainfall events. And that's really scary, because if we could have, if we had a larger event, it would obviously be really devastating. Well, what does this tell you? This tells you that the watersheds are severely damaged and that they're very reactionary, and it's getting worse. Every time when we're having this increased volume of rainfall, at least in some of the corridors, we're at average or above average, and you'll see this, that what happens is we're seeing the channels on forest becoming more efficient at transporting water. They're becoming more eroded and at transporting more sediment and creating more sediment. So it's getting worse over time, and it's going to get worse until many, many years down the road. It will eventually begin to start to recover. And the idea of what we propose to do on forests is to advance that recovery by about 75 years. That's the intention of that's why we call it watershed restoration, because we're restoring it to what will eventually happen, but we all don't want to wait 70 to 80 years for it to happen, right? So we want those watersheds to recover much more quickly. So, but this shows you the events that have taken place and some of the watersheds that were impacted by those events and the size of those events. So again, we've had more precipitation, but not intense. And this is one chart, and we have these charts for all of the watersheds. But if you look at the far right, that's landfill. It's like at twice what normal has been historically since the gauges were installed in 10. in 2010. The middle one is Upper Campbell Copeland, and then the far left is Thames Peaceful Way, which is this corridor. And you can see that you've had upwards of 14 inches of rainfall this year, and that is definitely above normal. There were some other years that there were heavier rainfall, but that is definitely above average. Whereas you can see in the Campbell corridor, it's probably been more like average, and then landfill has been much greater, and that's been one of the impacts, the reasons they've had so much impact in Doney Park as well, because that's combined with the floodwater off the mountain. So the first efforts, as you're well aware, we've spent a tremendous amount of effort and money investing in the short-term mitigation. We've now exceeded 1 million sandbags produced since we began in mid-June, and placed, we're upwards of 4 miles of concrete barrier, and lots of other efforts. We did secure some funding toward those costs from NRCS, what they call emergency or exigency funding. And we're expected to probably either approach or exceed $7 million total for just short-term mitigation and response. So this has been a very, very expensive effort trying to manage all of the impacts to the watersheds. Now I'm going to move into the long-term mitigation plan. And as was noted, when you look back at that date of 2012, we weren't at this point that we are now. It took us almost 2 years to get there. And I will say, though, when we got to this point then, we did have the funding in hand. We do not have federal funding in hand, and I'll talk more about that. But it took us, a lot of process. Really, there hadn't been much experience across the Southwest or West with this type of dynamic when Schultz hit, and we were on a very, very steep learning curve. So we mobilized very quickly, and so the engineers not only have been working on the short-term mitigation, but they've also been working on the long-term mitigation planning. So again, area-wide, we're looking at 4 watersheds that will need new major watershed restoration projects, including this watershed, because this watershed was not mitigated. And so we're looking at over 300 acres of alluvial fans and 1,000 new grade control. And again, Mike will explain what that means. And then expansion and repair on those that were mitigated back during Schultz. So that, and the next slide here then captures what does that look like across the watersheds, as well as some additional berms that we want to construct near Landfill Road, both on the east and west side of Landfill Road, and then some other repairs and things that we need to make to the existing Girls Ranch Road berm, as well as existing berms that are at the east end of Campbell, between Campbell and Landfill Road, need to be expanded and repaired as well. So price tag for the on-forest watershed restoration measures is about $40 million. And frankly, we went from $35 million at the early to mid-August, and the events that we had through August had a tremendous impact added another $5 million to that cost because of the damage that's now occurred on forests is so severe. Basically, every watershed on the forest now is, other than those that have been mitigated, most of those are hanging in there, but certainly elements of those, most of those water, particularly Wupaki trails, Lennox, have completely unraveled. So your watershed, Copeland, Government Tank, most of those have unraveled. So instead of those large flatter areas above the neighborhoods where water used to spread out and slow down, that's what we call these fans, alluvial fans. they're all severely eroded through, and the channels are anywhere from 5 to 25 feet deep. And that's why you're seeing all the sediment, that's why you're seeing all the boulder fields, all of that, that's what's contributing to that. In terms of the flood mitigation in the neighborhoods, we're looking at new flood mitigation in 3 flood corridors: Peaceful Way, Copeland, which would involve two channels, and then Government Tank. And then expanding the existing channel. So when you look at Wupaki Trails, they went from the channel that Chris Duza is one of our other engineers, key engineer in this whole process, engineered most of the measures last time within the neighborhood. It was designed for 140, 150 cubic feet per second, and now they're getting flooding. The modeling shows up to 2,000 cubic feet per second, and the proposal for that corridor is similar to yours, is to take the channel to 1,800 cubic feet per second capacity. So, and then stabilization and some expansion both within the Brandis and Campbell channels as well. So that price tag is coming in now. We're probably around 50 million. So significant investment there. And then the third leg of this integrated system is the highway drainage improvements. Those are necessary not only to reduce down the impacts to Highway 89 and 180, but particularly 89. I think now we're up to 8 closures and something like 4 or 5 partial closures of 89. That's also, how do we integrate, the neighborhood mitigation into those areas, and make sure that we aren't, one, creating hazards on the highway, but 2, also not creating issues downstream of the highway for people who live downstream of the highway as well. So with that, you can see this is a list of again, and this is all based on a conceptual level engineering. So these are all fairly, these are all, I'll say fairly rough estimates right now, but reasonable estimates in terms of what we're looking at in terms of cost. And we're looking at probably somewhere between 45 and 50 million for the highway related work as well. So then grand total for mitigation through the 9 watersheds. This does not include mitigation within the city of Flagstaff. This is only mitigation of the 8 watersheds on the east side. I'll say, north of Flagstaff, the 8 watersheds in this area. It does include mitigation to Schultz Creek on Forest. That's the watershed that's affecting Highway 180 and that Coconino Estates area that you've probably heard about from friends and seen in the newspaper and stuff. So as I mentioned, we have made an initial application to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we've been tentatively approved for that work that's under that application. There is no money in that fund right now to fund that EWPP program, so it's got to be appropriated. Funding will have to be appropriated by Congress to fund that. We're on the waiting list. So, and that application did include Peaceful Way, and the 5 corridors that are included is Wupaki Trails, Brandis, Peaceful, Copeland, and Campbell. And we selected those for the first run at the application because we had been approved for those corridors during, the Schultz effort. So some of the approvals that we need, both from Forest Service and NRCS, have already been put into place. So we knew we could likely move forward more quickly with those areas. And obviously it isn't all going to happen at once, but that was the reasoning behind that, is that we had conceptual plans in place. Some we'd already actually obviously constructed mitigation, and this just talks about what's proposed. And again, Mike will get into more information. It does not include Government Tank. My goal is to submit that application this week. We've had NRCS here. They've done their damage assessment and for that corridor, and again, I hope to submit that this week, and to again get us onto the waiting list. And then likely there'll be one more application for the paintbrush corridors, for some upgrades that we need to do within the paintbrush corridors. So that first application, and this is how this works out. We actually, the estimated total cost was about $24 million for the work. We submitted that, but we were only approved for $19.6 million. They have now deemed ineligible, and this is program-wide, doesn't have anything to do with our project, wouldn't matter what project it is, that they will no longer cover the cost of safety railing on channels, and they no longer cover the cost of fencing the channels. So that's a cost the district will have to pick up because it's deemed ineligible. So out of that 19.6, they would pick up, it says 75%, and that's true, but of the total costs, if you look back and you calculate off the 24 million, the district's going to pick up, NRCS is going to pick up about 62% of the cost, and the district will pick up the remainder between our match, which is 25%, and then those costs that are ineligible. We also have to cover the cost of any utility relocations that are required for installing the, and that was the case last time as well. But last time when we used this same funding source, they did cover safety railing and fencing, so that's a new issue for us. So again, we're on the waiting list. And then to talk about what's happening with the federal funding, we're working really closely with Congressman Halloran, Senator Sinema and Kelly. They've been extremely supportive. They've been here many times. They have a very great understanding about what is taking place here. They just authored a letter to the leadership of both houses of Congress and to the appropriations leadership of the appropriations committees, and are beginning to communicate with the appropriations committee members about why we need this funding. And so there's an effort, and as the supervisor mentioned, he's headed back next week to contribute to that discussion with congressional members and agencies next week about why we need this funding to be able to pursue these projects. That the district and county we don't have these kind of revenues. Our revenues are a fraction of what this cost is. And we're estimating the cost to be, the direct cost to the district to be at least $40 million. So we've got to secure that federal funding. The federal funding is crucial. So they're looking at what are the opportunities in terms of different pieces of legislation that may come forward, and how do we piggyback, I'll say, with those pieces of legislation to get the funding into the program. So, for example, funding that EWPP program so that then that wait list is funded and we could get funded. Similarly, on forest, we're looking to fund a program called Burned Area Rehabilitation Program, which could be used for the type of measures we're proposing. And we're looking to the Forest Service to fund that in its entirety. No match, fund the entire amount is our request. And then likewise on the highway funding, we're working with federal highways very closely. Last time, you're very aware because it's right in your neighborhood, we did get about $6.5 million to construct the Copeland Detention Facility. And we're looking to that funding source again. It's called Emergency Relief under Department of Transportation. And it looks like some of this area will qualify for that funding. We're working with them. Some of the money may go to ADOT directly for addressing the damages and impact of the highway, and some may come to the district, and we'll pursue those projects. But pretty extensive book of work there too, including expanding the basins, that we can expand the basins at Copeland by about 50%. And so, which would then really help reduce the impacts, not only of the highway, but downstream, and allow us to frankly construct the channels both within Peaceful and Copeland, because when you construct those channels, you're changing the rate of the flow, right? So we're working very, very hard at the federal level to get the appropriations we need to fund those two programs. The emergency relief program under DOT is funded. We don't need an appropriation. We just need to go through that process. Doesn't mean we'll be successful, but the money is there. It doesn't take a congressional action. The other two programs are going to take congressional action. So, and unfortunately, the EWPP funding fund has a backlog of over $600 million of projects right now. So, and it just was funded through the infrastructure bill to the tune of 400. So it gives you 400 million. So it gives you a sense about what have been the disaster impacts across the country, and other types of impacts that where communities are utilizing those funds. So we're working through that, but the whole timeline for this whole effort is going to be pretty much entirely dependent on when we get the funding, because we just don't have this magnitude of funding to be able to start to move forward. The little pieces we might be able to do a few things here. We do get some reimbursement for response through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management, and then the State Emergency Management. We get 75% reimbursement over about a three-year time frame. Takes forever, but they won't fund projects. So yes, ma'am.
So based on your understanding of the funding and where we are in terms of the queue at the federal level, what's the timeline?
That's what I'm saying. Right now, it's really hard to understand what would be the timeline, because it's all contingent on getting the appropriations. So if Congress does act sometime within, let's say the next 4 to 6 months, we were hopeful that they were going to pass what's called an emergency supplemental that would address many of the disasters, particularly the one in Kentucky where they had severe flooding there. Probably most of you saw that in the media. Right now, it's not clear they're going to move ahead with that. They're going to do like a continuing resolution and continue to fund the government. This is an election year. And so that whole dynamic of it being an election year is really playing out. So we were really hopeful they'd move ahead with emergency supplemental and we could piggyback onto that and get the programs funded through that. But now it's not so clear. It's looking like frankly, and then it's going to depend on who, whether it's very political, who's going to take over Congress and how quickly they may act. The Republicans are saying that if they get the House and Senate, then they don't want any decisions made till probably next winter, probably next spring. And so we don't, we're at the, and that's why we're having it. Fortunately, we have very influential senators and congressmen that are advocating strongly on our behalf to identify funds, and they're also helping us look at, are there any other smaller amounts, but some short-term funding. I'm meeting next week with the Forest Service to really rattle the cage there to say, we need to get out and get some work done now. We don't want to miss an entire construction season this fall. We need some money right away. Where can you find some money to get us jump-started, right? That's life. Last time, we were fortunate. We were in the same exact situation where EWPP had not been funded for several years, and there was a fairly significant backlog at that time, and we got funding within about 6 to 7 months, so by an action by Congress. So, and at that time, the EWP program funded both the on and off forest measures, so we only had to deal with one program. They made a decision in 2016 that you could no longer use those funds on federal lands. They can only be used on private or public infrastructure, like adjacent to like a public road. So anyway, that option isn't an option anymore. We're trying to change that, but we haven't been successful in changing that yet. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. And Mike Caroley's going to talk. Oh, sorry, here didn't I? Where'd it go? There we go. And Mike's going to talk both about the on and off forest measures. And what I'd prefer to do is let him go through it, and then I'll kind of close it out with a whole discussion about drainage easements and what's going to be involved in that process. Then we'll have Louise come up and talk about the SBA, and then we'll do a fairly small session of general questions, not specific to your property, but general. And then we'll break and go over here and look at the maps, and then we can get into more specific questions about the actual proposal. So with that, take it away, Mike.
Good evening. As Liz said, my name is Mike Caroley. I'm an engineer with National Channel Design here in Flagstaff. We, in National Channel Design, did all of the on-forest measures during the Schultz response and the Schultz mitigation measures back in 2012 to 2016. And we're back at it for this one, which is quite the significant challenge. So what we're going to be doing on your particular corridor is we'll be doing the on-forest work, the on-forest mitigation, the fan and watershed restoration, as well as, once we get that water to the neighborhood, developing the infrastructure to get through the neighborhood and down to the highway. So it's a two-part thing. My talk tonight is two parts. It's on forest and off forest through the neighborhood. But the first part is I'm going to talk about the forest area and the alluvial fans that are above your neighborhood and what the pipeline fire has essentially done to them. It's essentially overwhelmed their ability to handle the flows that they'd evolved to handle over the past centuries. The pipeline fire, Lucinda mentioned, has increased the flows coming down the mountain through this watershed on an order of 5 to 7 times greater than what it was before the fire. And as a result, we've got areas that there's a lot of sediment that's falling out in areas that used to be channels, and then we have areas that used to be alluvial fans where water would settle out that have been gullied through and eroding out, which sends all of that erosion, all of that sediment down through your neighborhood and deposits them on your property. So we have a series of, from the 420 road all the way down to your neighborhood, we have a series of incisions down cutting through what had been existing alluvial fans and areas of deposition, and that's just changing the water course as it comes down. And it's sending it into areas that haven't seen water for years. And this is an example. It's not too far above the neighborhood. We're on the left there, an area that used to be a channel, a whole bunch of sediment comes down, cobbles and boulders, drops out, and then sends the water off to the left of that photo there and sends it down into an area that used to be, kind of pristine alluvial fan and it wasn't seeing any water, and it's sending it into new parts of the neighborhood that wouldn't have seen it before this event. And that's fairly typical, going all the way up to the 420 road. So the watershed restoration measures in your neighborhood, or above your neighborhood on the forest. Basically what we're going to try to do is where we're seeing that erosion and where the alluvial fans have been cut through, or the existing channels have turned in from minor little 3-foot deep, 20-foot wide drainages that are now 4, 6, 10-foot deep and just straight gullies without any side slopes. Those gullies just source sediment as the water comes through with every storm event and continue to send it on down. What we're planning on doing in your neighborhood, this is your watershed right here, this Peaceful Way. It goes all the way up off the picture there, all the way to the top of the peaks. It comes on down. All this water that's gathered through this watershed comes on down and deposits into the Peaceful Way neighborhood. What we're planning on doing on forest is between the 420 road right here down to the forest boundary is repair those eroded channels and rebuild the alluvial fans. The area from the neighborhood boundary up, certainly past the power line up above there, and maybe even further. There are various opportunities to restore those alluvial fans to allow that water, when it comes down, to spread out, dissipate its energy, and drop sediment and keep it from coming into the neighborhood. And that's important, because when we do get into the neighborhood, we want all those, we need to be able to have basically clear water, or not as loaded water coming through there, so that those channels can function to take that water all the way down to the highway and not be clogged by the sediment like you've been seeing this summer. But yeah, like I said, there's a pretty good area of possibility for alluvial fan restoration. And then up above, where we'd be building alluvial fans, we will do grade control and stabilize the channels and keep them from eroding further. So the goal of all of on-forest restoration work that we're planning on doing is to reduce the sediment and stop that from sourcing and continuing on down the mountain. This is an example of a restoration effort that we did on the museum fire just this spring on one of the watersheds. This was the west tributary up above the Mount Ellen Estates neighborhood. This is basically before and after photos. This is before the existing alluvial fan that had been there, with all the flows that came out post-museum fire, gullied through that alluvial fan, allowed the water to be much more efficient, allowed the fan and the watershed to be much more efficient in delivery of the water downstream, and it brings all the sediment down and all the water down much faster and a much greater volume, and sends that on down towards the neighborhoods. What we do is take this situation and regrade out the alluvial fan, get rid of all the gullying, and so that the water spreads out across the entire area there. And as it spreads, it drops the sediment out and provides a much easier volume of water and volume of sediment to handle as it goes down, continues on down the watershed. So what do we do as we do the watershed restoration? We do a lot of stabilization and grade control. We do regrading of that. Like I said on the previous slide, we regrade out the alluvial fan, and we provide rock where there's significant slopes coming down. A lot of rock structures for grade control to prevent, as the water's coming down, to prevent those head cuts from migrating upstream and sourcing new sediment. Part of that grade control includes, across those alluvial fans, as we rebuild those, we bury sill structures. They might be log sills or they're rock sills. And what that does, we put those at intervals along this sloping plane that is the alluvial fan that we rebuild, so that as the water's going down, flowing downhill, there's a tendency for it to rill and create new channels and create new gullies. With the hardened grade control, whether it's a log or rock, that stops the rilling. And we put those in at intervals of 60, 70 feet, and so that we can maintain that sloping plane of the alluvial fan, so that it doesn't, again, go back to what we're seeing now of the sourcing all that sediment and sending it downstream. We also, in the channels, we put in large rock grade control structures. This is called a cross vein weir, using about 48-inch diameter rock in the bottom of the channel to prevent the head cuts from migrating upstream. This holds that channel in place, keeps it from deepening. It also protects the banks on the stream channels. We put these in where there's not enough width in the valley to create that alluvial fan. So, and there's from the 420 road on down, it's a system or a series of channels and alluvial fans. And basically, we're just looking to restore the channels and restore the alluvial fans. This is a kind of an after photo of a similar structure. This is during construction. This is after construction, where the flow has gone through, and you can see that the rock grade control held the channel grade in place. After we do all that regrading, we do reseeding and mulching, hydroseeding, or we hand cast the seed on the alluvial fan. One of the important factors for long-term mitigation, as you probably know, is the restoration of the vegetation. All that root mat and all the vegetation is an important component to keep the keep the erosion down over the long term. So we want to try to accelerate that recovery, accelerate the vegetation coming back. We also will spread mulch when we cut down the trees, what remaining trees there may be on this alluvial fan. We will grind those up into mulch and spread it over the top of the seed that's been spread. It helps hold the moisture and gives a chance for the seed to germinate and take off. We've had some pretty good success in these alluvial fans, both during the Schultz, and this is from the museum fire, a couple of the alluvial fans that we restored. So once we restore the watershed above the neighborhood, restore those alluvial fans, we got to take the water. The water's still coming down. We're trying to stop the sediment, but the water's still headed downhill. And what we're going to do is through the neighborhood, we got to route that water one way. We have to get it down to the highway. Our goal is to get it all the way down to those Copeland detention basins. So the off-forest design considerations, there's a number of them, but your watershed was mostly burned during the Schultz fire, but it wasn't completely. It wasn't burned all the way in those high elevations, and there was a lot of trees that still remained down close to the neighborhood. Well, with the pipeline fire, it's been completely burned. As I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So the hydrology now, post-pipeline fire, is about 1,207 cubic feet per second that enters into your neighborhood at the forest boundary. And then we have to figure out some way to get that amount of water. That's clear water, so to speak. That's without the sediment. That's a lot of water coming down. So we're looking to transport that water. We have to come up with some sort of infrastructure to get it down to the highway. We also need to achieve a positive cost-benefit ratio. That's one of the NRCS funding requirements, that the benefit outweighs the cost. And we also want to create no adverse impacts. So all of our design measures that we put out there are checked by an independent firm here in town, J.E. Fuller, as Lucinda mentioned, and they take all of our design surfaces, they run a hydraulic model through it, and they check to make sure that after we're done, that there is no adverse impact to any of the areas where the water's flowing through. So we want to make sure that any houses, any residences that weren't seeing water before the flow event or before we started work will not see any water after. And if they were seeing some water, we don't want to increase that amount of water or the depth of water that hits their property. We want to basically have a net positive benefit everywhere. So other design considerations, the channel alignments. The proposed channel basically follows the existing flood path through the neighborhood. As we're designing them, we're not trying to put the water into areas that wasn't already seeing some of the flooding. And in the urban neighborhood, that's particularly true, where the flood path that I'm going to show you here in a minute essentially follows the primary path of the flow that you've been seeing this summer. Where possible, I'm trying to put them along shared property lines. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but we are trying to put it along the property lines so that we're not dividing properties. And we're also trying to avoid paralleling roads. If at all possible, we're trying to put them on common property lines where there isn't a road, so that you don't have this road and channel system right together. One of the reasons for that is for safety. If you put it in an area where there's not a whole lot of traffic, foot traffic or vehicle traffic, it may be a little bit safer. We will need easements across all the private properties. In order to construct these, the county has to be able to get in there after it's complete and do maintenance, because there will certainly be maintenance. We're not going to be able to stop all of the sediment from coming down off the forest, and we'll need to be able to get in there and occasionally clear out and maintain the channel infrastructure. So we're taking it all the way. We need easements all the way from the forest down to the Copeland detention facility. Right now, as you know, you're living in a fairly dispersed development out there, fairly large lots as compared to other areas. And there was no, basically a lot split development. There was no platting, no formal subdividing of the neighborhood, so there's no infrastructure that went along that was built. So we're kind of coming in after the fact and building that infrastructure for you. And what we're proposing in this neighborhood, as well as the Copeland corridor and the Wapatki corridor, is we're chasing funding to build rectangular concrete channels. And this channel is going to be very similar to the others, where it's going to be essentially on the scale of 20-foot wide bottom, about 3 foot deep minimum depth, and the ultimate capacity of that would be about 1,800 cubic feet per second. Our design storm, per that previous slide, is about in the range of 1,200 CFS, but we provide a little bit of freeboard in the channel so that the ultimate capacity before it overtops is, we've got a little bit of safety, room for safety there, and like I said, the ultimate capacity is about 1,800 cubic feet. A lot of water. And wherever we cross roadways and driveways, wherever we have one of those crossings, we're essentially going to build a concrete box culvert that'll have essentially the same cross-sectional area as that channel. So we're not going to build, it's a 20-foot wide, and these box culverts are going to span that entire channel. We won't have a center pier through there. We don't want to give any obstructions to this flow because, there will be some sediment in it, reduced, but it'll still have sediment in there. We want to keep that water flowing uninterrupted, unobstructed from the forest to the Copeland detention basins. So as I said, we're going to follow the existing path of the primary flood flow as we've observed this summer. We also want to increase the ability to transport the sediment and debris. And with those concrete channels, the ability to carry that flow in the smoother section as opposed to maybe a more roughened natural channel, it has a much greater capacity going through the neighborhood. Maintenance is another consideration. If we have a concrete channel in there, especially being 20-foot wide, county can get equipment in there periodically as needed and clear out that sediment. Let's let him get through.
Just one question. You have the Brandisway channel, right?
What's that?
The Brandisway, you have that channel, right?
Yeah.
You have that capacity. It overflowed twice. But the Peaceway watershed, you just up the little way, what, less than 12 miles?
Peaceful Way?
Tie that into the Brandisway.
Brandisway doesn't have the capacity to accept that extra flow.
I mean, since you're going to redo the whole thing, might as well make it 2 foot.
And there is a little.
Because the reason I say that is the overflow, it were more damage.
Yeah, we'll talk about it at the end, but plus it's really a very bad thing from an engineering perspective, and legally you can't move water from one watershed to another. That's a real big no-no. But we wouldn't have the capacity at Brandis to do it anyway, even if we wouldn't. There'd have to be a separate channel. That's always been designed that way. So, and again, it would never meet the no impact analysis. It would never meet the no adverse impact analysis. We would never make it through that. Doesn't have anything to do with Forest Service. It has to do with engineering, basic engineering principles. Because once you push water somewhere it hasn't been, then it won't go past the no adverse impact. Because you have to run that modeling at larger storms. And then what you're doing is you're flooding everybody along Brandis with your water, and that's a no. That's immoral and illegal. So, go ahead, Mike.
Okay. The other design considerations are fencing and safety barriers. As Lucinda mentioned, those aren't eligible for reimbursement by the feds, but they're still going to be an important factor because with these concrete channels and the slopes that we have in them, the water is going to be flowing quite fast, and we need to have barriers in there to prevent children, animals, just anybody from getting in there. The roadway and driveway elevations, one of our goals is basically maintain those. We don't want to change the vertical or horizontal alignments of driveways if at all possible. There will have to be some realignments in some cases, but in most cases we don't want to change those driveway elevations or the roadways themselves. And also, we'd like to minimize the utility relocations, because that also is not a reimbursable cost. In some cases though, and in your corridor, that's going to be unavoidable. We will have to relocate some of the water lines, gas lines, and certainly some of the services lines. So here's where a lot of you probably came to find out, where are we putting this concrete channel? And we are, as I said, we're trying to follow where the water's gone basically where the water's gone this summer. And it basically, we'll do our on-force measures up here. We'll terminate our on-force measures with the terminal trench, gather up all that water, and then direct it down into the neighborhood. We're trying to follow the property lines as much as possible. Some cases it's unavoidable, but we are following the existing path. Coming on down here, this is Dunlap, and Thames comes on up here. We're following this common property line all the way down through what has been termed the Grand Canyon by a lot of people, where all that erosion is, right in here. And crossing Glen, and then continuing on the flood path down south of Doyle. Down along here, there's another really deep head cut that's formed right in this area. We're following right through that. And then we're coming on down to the El Dorado, following down along this common property line and working our way into the Copeland Basin. That's our general concept. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of engineering to do, so there may be some shifting of that. There's other considerations as we really dig into it. There's a concept level for illustration only, but that's the general alignment that we're following. I have when we break and we've got into get into the tables, I took a bunch of screen captures from a drone video that somebody took back in July. I don't know if that person's here, but it was a very useful drone video that showed a lot of that flooding, showed where that path is, and it was very helpful for me to figure out where it was going and where to put this in. I know, and I mentioned before, that with the on-force measures, the water's taking paths that it hadn't taken before. But generally, I've been up here walking this watershed several times, and this has become the primary flow path down through here that most of the water, unless you get a really big flow event, is taking this. Water in excess of most flow events, occasionally when you get a really big flow, I know it does flow down through here and work down, but the way it is evolved this summer and the way it looks that it's going to continue is going to follow this way if we leave it unadjusted. Can we wait until after to take those questions?
You know how you pointed out where occasionally it runs there? It's back over there now. That's where it started out in 2010. Now it's back
What?
down below your line there.
Let's talk after with the maps that I've printed out one-on-one. It's a lot easier to plot out what your concerns are. And like I said, this is conceptual. We know that there's going to be some room for changes when we get into the hard engineering, but generally that's the alignment that we're trying to follow. This is an example of a project that Chris Duza did recently. This is over in the Mountaindale neighborhood on the west side of Flagstaff, but this kind of gives you a flavor of what these channels look like. 20-foot wide bottom, about 3-foot high sidewalls with safety rails on both sides. And then where there's a road crossing, we've got a clear span of the road, of the bridge that crosses to keep that water flowing through. What we're proposing for this neighborhood, for Wapatki trails and for the Copeland corridors, are very similar to this. And just more of the same pictures. But I'm sure Chris, when he gives his talks, has a lot more to talk about these that I can't seem to remember. But that, like I said, that gives you the flavor of what we're talking about. It's got lots of room in there to get the equipment down in there to clean out the sediment that we'll be seeing, and is a very efficient channel to pass the water through. And back to Lucinda.
Thank you, Mike. Hey, Mike, do you remember from the original design back in 12 what the capacity of the natural channel that was proposed at that time? Do you remember what the CFS was?
No, I don't.
My memory
I'd
was
be
it
able to
was
get it. I think it would
maybe
only be
around
several hundred.
200.
It would only be several hundred CFS.
Yeah, it was 200 to maybe 300.
Yeah,
So it was a
at most.
fraction of the size of what we're
Right.
proposing here. Which I'll tell you, I think it was interesting when, as the supervisor mentioned, we co-hosted with Congressman O'Halloran a meeting on August 17th where we brought out the chief deputy from the Forest Service as well as a deputy undersecretary over the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as well as had a representative from Federal Highways here to present this initial plan to them. And then we did the tour, and as he shared, it rained heavily, particularly in the Campbell area, and that really got their attention, which was great. They kept saying, "How did you stage this?" I said, "Well, you can decide who staged it, but God came through, let's just say." And so, but in that conversation with them was, how do you anticipate that there will be, like in terms of looking at the capacity of these channels and making sure that they can adapt to whatever the future dynamics look like, right? And so I think the intent this time is to try to construct something that will weather future, whatever those, not every flood of every rainfall event, but weather a lot of potential change in those watersheds over time. So, and the importance of another important piece of the on-force measures is that it does then, and we've seen this repetitively in the other mitigated corridors, is that it does then ultimately define where that water goes. Otherwise, you could build a channel like this, and 2 years later or 6 months later, it could be flowing on a completely different path. So, because the on-force area is changing so dramatically. So, when you're able to go up and stabilize those fans, put in that terminal trench, you have a lot more ability to know where the water's going to go. And then the downstream mitigation can then be developed and designed to receive that water. So just want to quickly touch on, what are the next steps to move forward with here. And obviously, if the district's going to come on to private property, we have to be able to have the ability to access those properties legally. And the mechanism for doing that is what's called a drainage easement. Basically, that grants access to the district to come on to the property and make improvements for the purpose of drainage. Aren't other purposes for that, but it's for the purpose of drainage. And again, the first step to that is getting that right of entry, so that the follow-on, as Mike indicated, so far all this work is really at a conceptual engineering level, and they'll need to go out and do actual survey work and things like that to actually really do a design. We have a little bit of money to start some of that, but most of that engineering will have to wait until we get those federal funds. But we want to get everything in place so that as soon as we get the funds, we can start moving forward with activity. So again, the first step is the right of entry forms, and then next step is moving to the, once the design is, and that's a process that Mike will be working with you, largely for those that are directly impacted, one-on-one working with you through that and talking about what's happening with the design and so far and so forth. And this just talks about, it's a right for an entity to enter another, entity's property in effect, and it'll allow the county the access and then to maintain that. And you retain ownership of the land. As he's talked about right now, I think we've got a pretty good alignment that's been identified. Again, if we stray out of that alignment where the vast majority of the water's going, then we will not make it through the no adverse impact analysis. So we've got to be really conscious of that, and you can't have a channel that does this. You know, you got to have a channel that's gonna function, right? It won't affect the zoning of your property. It doesn't allow for public access. This is for the purpose of drainage solely. And it will limit the use of that property, obviously. There's going to be a channel there. You can't construct within that easement. You can't utilize that property for construction or things like that. You know, what we're doing is trying to, you know, create something here that will give us the greatest benefit extent possible to mitigating the impacts to those properties, right? So, will you be compensated? No, and during Schultz, this was the same policy. We either have money to buy easements or do projects. We don't have the money to do both. And so, what we did do last time, and I'm meeting with the assessor to discuss this with him, is that we did identify a couple things. One was that for those, so in effect, we're asking that you donate the easement. And for that donation, we set up a program last time where we reduced the property component of your taxes, of your property taxes. Your property tax has two elements to it. It has your home and then your property valuation. And we reduced the property valuation, or reduced the property tax element on the property segment of that. And so you got a tax benefit for a 3-year window. In addition, we will provide you with the documentation that you can also, any donation of, any type of donation to the government is tax deductible. And so you'll have to work with your accountant or whoever does your taxes to determine how that may affect your specific taxes, but we'll provide you with the documentation to document that you made that donation to a government entity, and there's the potential tax benefit from that. So, again, you may get a temporary reduction in your primary property taxes as well as state and federal income tax benefits. So, and we'll be working with an entity that will help orchestrate those processes, and they'll go through, there's an act, a federal act that we need to follow with that called the Uniform Act, and there's a set of communications that we'll have with you about a package that indicates what do we need, what are we offering in terms of that easement, what's the benefit, and so forth, and then go through that process. In addition to that, if you have a mortgage on your home and property, which most of us do, then that mortgage company also has to approve the easement, drainage easement. And frankly, that was a huge challenge during Schultz, and probably will be a challenge again. Not because they don't understand the value, they've understood that they've lost value in this property because of the flooding. It's just their process. They're just very slow to respond. And last time I actually went to Congresswoman Kirkpatrick and her office, and fortunately, the person there that worked with me last time is now in Senator Kelly's office, and I've already got her teed up to say, hey, if I need help getting to those mortgage companies to get them to get us the releases within a reasonable time frame, that she knows what to do to help with that, because that was a major challenge last night, getting them to turn that process around in a reasonable time frame. So in terms of the steps moving forward, again, key to all this is securing the federal funding, getting those appropriations. That's really, that's the entire focus right now, because we know what we need to do. We need to get the funding to be able to go do it. So, and then once we secure that funding, is moving through the engineering process, conducting that no adverse impact analysis, of course, as part of that. All that will be shared with you. Securing, initially the right of entry, and then ultimately the drainage easements and mortgage releases. and finalizing the engineering in that process. So, and then also we have a set of approvals we have to get, approvals for some of the area that's proposed for improvements on forest was not cleared through the National Environmental Policy Act last time, so we will have to get those areas cleared and walk through that process. They're working very closely with us right now. Mike and his compadre Alan we shared now, well, over about 2 months ago, we shared the initial plan on forest with them, and they're working through a process now to get all the clearances done for these projects. So we're hopeful that that won't be a stumbling block. And then, of course, there'll be a cost to the flood control district, and that district the board will have to make that decision too in terms of funding that matched the grants and so forth. And then, of course, going through the contracting process. And here, one of the big challenges we have is we have 2 fairly short construction seasons between snow and monsoon on either end. Although I think we've learned a lot about what we can do. And I think, in terms of particularly the on-forest work, being able to expand a little bit more of that work into the winter season, but that will be a limitation because at some point it just gets too wet to get equipment in, right? That's just a reality of our area. So with that, I'm going to ask Louise to come up, Louise Porter with Small Business Administration. She's going to hit some highlights on the program, and again, they have an office set up at Health and Human Services on King Street, and again, I really encourage everybody to go there and they also have a call-in line, and the application's also online and so forth too. So there's a lot of places to access information, but I think going in and meeting with those people and getting an application is the way to start. So
yeah, absolutely. Am I on? Yes, I can hear myself. All right, excellent. And since you mentioned the location, I'll start with that first. I've left some of these yellow pieces of paper up at the desk with Shirley, so if you'd like to grab one on the way out, I don't want to force anyone to take one, but it'll remind you, because it's so bright yellow, to go there and see them. And that location closes on October 6th. So it's only open for another 2 weeks, so it's very limited. All right, so on this point, I want to start with saying that during declared disasters such as this one that happened because of a request from the governor, the Small Business Administration provides low interest rate loans for homeowners and renters, as well as businesses of all sizes and most private nonprofits. We have 3 different programs. We have home damage, and we have business damage, and we also have economic injury. So I just wanted to put that out there. The very first step is to put the application in. And like Lucinda was saying, we really encourage people to put the application in, even if you're not sure that you are interested, because the deadline is November 18th. I wanted to make sure I looked at that and got it straight, because it's a pretty hard deadline. I find it very heartbreaking to have to talk to people that come in after the deadline or call in, and they have to make a request for a late acceptance, and the agency needs to make a determination if you are late because of reasons that are beyond your control. And the agency does not consider, well, I didn't think I wanted it or I didn't need it. They don't consider that to be beyond people's control. So we encourage you to put it in, because once you put the application in, there's a couple things that can happen. You can be approved, you can be declined, or you can be withdrawn. If you are approved, you have up to 60 days to make the decision as to whether or not you want to accept it. You're not required to accept it. You can take some time to look at the terms and see if that works for you. If you decide you don't want it, it can cancel, and then you have up to 6 months. It's automatic. They'll send you a letter that you have up to 6 months to request a reinstatement of those funds. So if people are declined, you have the right to request a reconsideration. And then if that is declined, you have the right to request a final appeal. And that gives you an opportunity to ameliorate the concern. So it's all very personal and very individual. So the very first thing is to put that application in. I'll also mention that the rates are as low as this is why I brought my glasses. 1.688. So if you see the fact sheet that we've left there for everybody, there is a chart. There are 2 interest rates. There's a higher rate and a lower rate. They call it credit available elsewhere and no credit available elsewhere. It is not based on credit at all. It's a calculation that's done at the time of processing that takes into consideration your entire situation, including the damages. When you put the application in, the very first thing that happens is that a loss verification team member will contact you and determine how much you could be eligible for based on your damages. And they know that's an estimate because sometimes when people are going through the building process, they need to request an increase. So that's a possibility on an approved loan. Another thing that's a possibility on an approved loan is an increase of up to 20% for a mitigation project. So that is putting the cart before the horse in a big way because that's on an approved loan. So the very first thing is to get that application in. So, you know, also, with that program, you have to make the request yourself. The agency won't come to you and ask you about that. You do need to make that request, and it does need to have a estimate with it. All right, so the agency is not allowed to lend for any damages that are getting a recovery for. So insurance. So if insurance is covering you, then the agency isn't allowed to lend for that damage. Except the thing is that sometimes insurance takes a while to come through, or sometimes you don't want to accept what they're saying. This program can lend the funds to help get you started, and then if and when insurance comes, it can go to repay those funds. So again, the very first thing is to put the application in. The biggest reason people are declined is credit history and repayment ability. This is a direct from the Treasury program, so it is taxpayer funds, and we do have to be good stewards of taxpayer funds. But like I said, you have some recourse once you get that application in. And you know, I will tell you, I can talk for like 8 hours on this program, and I do not want to do that to you tonight, because if you're like me, you're starving. So I definitely don't want to do that, but I want to make sure I answer your questions and are here and let you know that we do have those people that are available to talk to you. You can start the application online, and then if you have questions, you can call or you can go in. You can actually download the paper application and send it in if you'd like. So there's a lot of different options. I know there's been a lot of questions about what is eligible. Again, that is a determination that is made at the time of processing. So the most important thing is to get that in, but there is eligibility for debris removal, and there is eligibility for land. But what does that mean for you is going to be individual, and I will not know because I don't know what your land is like, and I don't know a lot of those answers. So in order to get those answers, put the application in. You know, and one other thing, and I didn't mention this to you, Lucinda, but I just crossed it. It's in my head, and I feel like I should say it, is that the loss verification team does complete a like a full pages and pages about your damage, and that is available under the Freedom of Information Act after it's done. So that might be something that would be helpful for people to know, that you can make that request to get a copy of your file from the agency. Let's see, is there any? Yes, thank you. Access roads to primary residences are eligible. So even if there's more than one family or property on that, it happens a lot, and they everybody needs to put in an application, and then they turn it into a road association. But again, that's putting the cart before the horse, because we got to put the application in, and then we have a legal department and the legal teams. They assign, once you're approved, they assign a case manager for you that helps you go through anything that you would need like that, like putting that sort of an association together. So, anything else you can think of? Oh, yes.
So if you put your application in, how much time do you have to accept?
Oh.
Put your application in, how much time do you have to accept the loan if you're approved?
You have 60 days from the date of approval to make that decision. And again, if you decide, the agency can cancel it after those 60 days. If they don't hear from you and they try to contact you and they don't get any response, they will cancel it, and they'll send you a letter that says you have up to 6 months to request a reinstatement. But you can also make that request. So there's options once you get it in, but not getting it in, the options get a lot lower. So, yeah.
Any other questions on the SBA program?
and those bright yellow ones, so you can find us.
Yeah.
And
West
yeah,
has them as
on the fact sheet, and as you know, I need my readers, but on the fact sheet on the back at the bottom is the address of where to go to put the application in online. Or it's been great. There's so much community assistance with getting this information out. I'm sure you'll see a link on a social media site or on somebody's webpage, and you can just click it and go right there. And then we have our customer service center is available from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern time, Monday through Friday, and they can answer some questions for you or help walk you through any, they can also give you a status update on your actual application. So. And I will be available if anyone has any questions.
Great, thank you, Louise. Thank you. And so, again, this is an opportunity. I know many of you have a lot of sediment and debris on your properties and don't necessarily have the resources to hire contractors. What I'm really, really strongly encouraging you all to do is to work together within the neighborhood, because some of you have major head cuts and you need sediment and you need rocks and you need, be able to fill those head cuts. And some people have a lot of sediment and debris that needs to be disposed of, right, removed from your property. So I'm hoping people will work together, bring down the cost of dealing with that. Then everybody has to borrow less money, less impact on you. But these interest rates are extremely favorable. It's virtually the lower rate. If you qualify for that lower rate, that's free money. So,
Something I forgot to say.
yeah,
Sorry, no, I'll grab it. My apologies.
I turned it off. Yeah.
Sorry. I wanted to say that even if you've already maybe made some purchases on a credit card at 17-20%, those items that are, even if they're already purchased, they're still eligible. You could pay that credit card off with the lower rate. So that's another favorable thing to remember, that you don't.
Right, that's a good point.
Yeah, even if that money's already been spent, it's still eligible.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right, so all the information is on the Schultz Pipeline website as well. So if you get home and want to look at that, you can look at that, and it has all the links as well to their program, and the phone number and the location and everything is there as well. So, all right, any other general questions? We're going to take just a couple of questions. It's getting late, and I want people to be able to go over and meet with Mike and Shirley.
I just also have the right of entry form, so if anybody wants to.
Yeah, jumpstart the process. Thank you, Shirley. All right, any general questions?
Substantial flooding this morning. Why didn't we get a notification? Why wasn't there a public safety alert?
I know that in terms of the notifications that we got today, none registered very significantly in terms of the gauges and what they were monitoring and working with. And I know we sent out observers, and there was some flow, but we didn't see. I didn't see that we experienced it.
Well,
That's
David,
what I was
didn't
told.
you say you had to go around?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This morning.
Yeah, no, I know they did go out and clear some debris from some roads. Yeah, I know they did have to clear some debris and so forth. But, the warning system, and Wes may want to speak to this as well, the warning system is really when we anticipate flash flooding. I mean, that imminent threat to life, right?
Well, that
And
was,
Yeah. Yeah, and we can't predict everything everywhere. We've got a system, we're doing the best with the system that we have. So, but that's good to understand that you had that experience today.
and then another question, back to the map where you're doing the channeling. A lot of the water is coming from the Brandis Way channel. It's water that's overflowing that channel. How is that being mitigated? Because it doesn't look like
Well, we
that's
have
even a part
mitigation
of-
that's going to take place in the Brandis corridor as well. And yes, there has been some overflow, but most of what we're seeing in the corridor that we're referring to here tonight is within that corridor. So there is some lower down, you're right, the southern section there. And we're expanding that channel to some degree and hardening it. That's part of the
Well,
proposal
because
for
from the
Brandis.
events on the 17th and 24th of August, from the Piestua House, you could see
Yeah, no, there
tons
were,
of
that was a
water
major
coming
flood
over
event.
to us.
Yeah, the 14th as well was a big event on Brandis. So yeah, we're expanding both on Forest, the alluvial fan on Forest is being expanded, as well as to some extent the channel system, but then the channel system's also being hardened and expanded. Chris, anything else you want to add to that?
I think you hit the highlights. Yeah, there will be work in Brandis corridor up on the Forest, as well as to the channel itself, which will increase the capacity there.
And we did see, as we have in a lot of the corridors, that particularly the first set of bigger flood events, that there was also a lot of debris that came down, burn debris, particularly off the tunnel fire, and that impacted the flows in those corridors as well. So other questions? General questions? Yes, ma'am.
So, I understand there's 3 phases, there's the on-forest, residential, and highway.
Right.
Are you gonna be attacking these 3 areas sequentially or in parallel? Do you have a high-level plan for
Yeah,
how you're approaching this?
typically, we would want to be able to sync up the on-forest measures with the neighborhood measures. Because frankly, to construct the channels downstream and not do the work on forest, they're not going to work. It's just going to fill up with sediment. And so, the number one priority is getting the work done on the forest. That is always going to be the number one priority. The sooner we can get the work done on forest, you'll even see some level of relief from that, right? And so that would always be the priority. At the same time, when you look at, and if you go online, we did a big presentation Tuesday, us and me and the team, and there's a lot of information in there. Right now, the timelines that are on there are, I'll say, speculative, because it's all based on, our best hope of how quickly we'll be able to get funding. But you'll see that it's very much synced up, that we do the peaceful on-forest and the peaceful corridor pretty much in the same time frame. One might be fall, one might be spring, but they're in that same time frame, so that we're getting that mutual benefit. Because again, it doesn't do any good to construct downstream unless we get that on-forest measures done. So, but if I can get the on-forest funding now, we'll go do the on-forest work. We will still need the measures in the neighborhood, because we've got to be able to convey those flows through the neighborhood safely, of course. So, good question. The highway dynamic may take a little bit longer. The money is there, but that process tends to be a little bit slower. We'll see the types of measures, but that isn't, I don't expect that. They've already been very favorable as to expanding the Copeland Detention Basin, because they made an original investment in that with us, and so the feedback we're getting, particularly on that effort, is that they're pretty favorable to that expansion. And they understand that that's integrated with what we're proposing upstream. And for that detention basin, obviously that detention basin now is limited because we didn't arrest the sediment on forest, right? There's 135,000 cubic yards of sediment in that basin right now. And we've removed parts of it over the time, as many of you know. So they also know that there's a benefit to that in the highway. So I feel more assurance that we'll get that funding for that structure, because they've already invested in that, and they've already seen the value many times in the past for that structure, so several times in the past. Yes, ma'am.
So does the detention basin work include any work to the box culvert at Kevin's Way? Because it got completely plugged up during
during the events
Yeah,
this summer?
the mini events. So it may, right now, what we're looking at is some reconfiguration. Part of what's contributing to that is, one, obviously, there's just a tremendous amount of sediment coming. But one, the work upstream, expanding that fan on Brandis is really important to that. But then also some of the other work that's being proposed, and then they're proposing to expand. If you note now, if you'll remember after Schultz, from Brandis about, I don't know, I'll say maybe a quarter of a mile or so, south of that, there was that Shot Creek channel that ADOT put in. That's fairly flat, and it's overtopped there a number of times. You've probably all seen that. And so the proposal is to turn that channel into a rectangular channel all the way to Brandis. So we'll get better flow and frankly less impact to the highway. That will help that box culvert perform better, but also the entry into the detention facility, they're gonna completely re-engineer that to better address the sediment buildup there. So when they get into the real engineering, they may have to expand that. But they may not have to. It may be that with everything combined, it should function fairly well. And it did, even during the 1,000-year flood event, it functioned really well. So, I mean, it filled up and all that, but it had a pretty good function. So, all right, one more question, general question, and then people can go take a look at the plans. Any other general questions? All right, well, thank you very much for being here tonight, and we're here for you, and we're going to keep moving forward, and hopefully we'll be able to effectuate some really positive change for you.